Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to have you here at the House of German Business in Berlin. I would have said a warm welcome from my side on behalf of the Association of German Chambers of Commerce and Industry, but that is wrong. It is a warm welcome, but it's on behalf of the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry and not the association anymore. So we have transformed our organization, but maybe this is the only change. And one thing what has not changed throughout the course of at least 12 months is the spiral of new regulations, Mr. Annen. It's not your fault, but maybe you have some answers to that when it comes to international trade. From our perspective, at least, international supply chains have never been that much under scrutiny as they are today. And maybe this is the same what I have said in 2021 when we have hosted the last ICC supply chain forum. But at least this is even truer today. In 2021, we've had a shortage of containers and traffic jams of container ships, as well as supply shortages due to a high global demand. We like high global demand, but at that time we had several bottlenecks due to the repercussions of the corona pandemic. Some goods still take a lot longer to ship, but we have to admit, and that's a good and very welcomed development, there are easing developments on the supply side. Now, or this year, 2023, the greater question is not only when I will get my commodities, but it's more if I can get them in general or if I can rely on getting things in the future, commodities, supplying goods. Geopolitics have changed in the last year due to the aggressive Russian war against Ukraine, and international trade is at risk to fall apart, some say in two separate blocks, some say it's maybe even worse, maybe in a multipolar world, a fragmented division, a much more fragmented, maybe then the word division of international labor is wrong, or might be, we do not hope, a world which is going to be at least a bit more deglobalized than before. One of the rule-setting driving forces, or the rule-setting driving force, the USA, they engage, I don't think that they agree, if I would say, in a decoupling process from China, but a disentanglement process or de-risking process at least. And at the same time, the Inflation Reduction Act includes instruments which are against the rule-setting developments done or began more than 25 years ago with the building up of the World Trade Organization. So there are some reasons to be a bit concerned, to put it mildly. There's a lot to discuss. I will keep it short. Here in my welcoming address, we have opportunity to discuss these things and other things which are related to supply chains, which are related to a possible, likely development of globalization or deglobalization, with a wonderful panel here, riddled with experts, but this later. So welcome here at the House of German Business on behalf of the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which is a proud part of ICC network, of ICC on the global level, but of course of ICC in Germany. And with this, I'm very proud to hand over to my friend and the chair of ICC Germany, Holger Bingmann. The floor is yours, Holger.
So, thank you very much, Volker. So we didn't change the organization, we didn't change the name. We still are the International Chamber of Commerce, being created a little bit more of 100 years ago, after the First World War, a little bit in the same situation as actually. So some merchants were scared what is happening in the world and what will happen in the world. And luckily to be here with you to discuss these discussions about supply chain, about digitalization from an international side. And if you allow me, being an entrepreneur by passion, I see, of course, all these instabilities in the world. But the second thing, and everybody who does international trade knows how complicated international trade still is. There are still about 30 pages to be printed on each documentation of an international trade subject. And if you multiply this throughout the world, then thank you very much for ICC and all the organizations in the world that try to make digital, or might try to make supply chains not only from a resilient way more secure, but also from a daily work more secure and easy. Don't even think of all the copies that are printed and according to German law, 10 years stored somewhere in the backyard of your company. So luckily that this convention, but a lot of people throughout the world are discussing how can we make this life easier for each of us. Welcome to the ICC's and of course the DIHK supply chain. Lucky to see so many representatives here from the public and private sector. Thank you very much. I think it's exactly in this atmosphere and of innovation and zest for action for which we brought this forum to life. In times marked by rising and overlapping uncertainties, as we discussed before, it's even more crucial to seek out collaboration, hear different perspectives, and exchange ideas. I know that the typical German word Wandel durch Handel is not more so political correct as it has been for decades. And some political leaders made clear that it is no more existence. Let's adapt it maybe a little bit. It is still communication through handel. So if you deal with each other, you have to talk somehow with them. And I think that's absolutely necessary. Rising prices, supply bottlenecks, staff shortages put so much pressure on all of us that makes life a little bit unhappy. But with that in mind, I'm confident that the program of the ICC Supply Chain Forum will fruitfully enhance discussions. Thank you to a variety of interesting speakers today and the next days. Law firms, international, multilateral organization. In our opening panel today, we will hear several of those esteemed speakers presenting their perspective to the topic, regulating international trade, the more, the better. I'm very much looking forward for your discussion. And with protectionism on the rise again, how should internationally acting companies adapt and how can they be supported? Digitalization for sure is the key of unlocking a bigger potential. Undoubtedly, it does play an important role, as we will be able to see during the next 2 days in 4 panel sessions. If you allow me, I'll just make a short jump on it. It's digital trade for sustainability and climate action. It's digitalization for human rights, efficiency and fraud prevention in the digital area, and paperless trade and beyond. Even that the word digital is missing on the last title, you clearly see that digitalization for us is the key, that we as an international organization would love to make trade easier and more secure. For the moment, international trade is a little bit still an analog bastion. Despite continuing digitalization, the documents are currently produced in paper form. These processes are time-consuming, costly, and particularly prone to errors and fraud, as we discussed before. At the same time, only 7 countries out of 195 have a legislation based on an influence by the unilateral, I don't know who made this shortage, unilateral meter, that aims to enable the legal use of electronic transferable records, both domestically and across borders. How about Germany? Germany is 99% ready and compliant with MLETR. We are really close. According to an ICC study we did 2 years ago, a full digitalization of trade transaction between the G7 countries could generate additional growth of $9 trillion by 26. Let's go for it. Let's go for it. As one of the leading export nations, Germany would especially benefit from this digitalization in international trade. All in all, we need to be more aware of this because, in my opinion, this means a great opportunity, but one that also requires a high level of international cooperation. In this respect, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has unfortunately intensified some debates around the world. The question of the future of globalization is more typical than ever at the moment. For me, the clear answer to this, not only do I think that there's no going back to times prior globalization, we actually need it to meet to our global challenges. With that being said, I'd like to thank you again, Volker Dreyer and the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry for the partnership hosting this event here, and wish everybody an inspiring afternoon and 2 more days in digital once again at the ICC Supply Forum. And I'd like to hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Holger. I'm back as the moderator, and I have to. There's the need to make up for an information, which I forgot right at the beginning. Our conference is streamed and also recorded live. Yeah, for those who could have not made it here to Berlin, and later on via the chat, you have the opportunity to send questions to the panel. So thank you. Thank you, Holger, for your insightful opening remarks. And you see how digital I am with my paper stuff here. So there's also room for improvement. Now I'm happy that we have also a well-known representative of the German government here. It's Nils Annen, who is currently the Parliamentary State Secretary at the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, who will give us an introduction also into the topic. And I would like to tease you with just some keywords. There has been a lot of discussion and still going on about dependency, about de-risking, decoupling, diversification. And maybe I stop here at diversification. And we have some doubts that, or the feeling, and many companies do have, that there might be a contradiction between the goals of the German Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz, cannot avoid it, yeah, the due diligence law or supply chain act, which is took place at the 1st of January this year, and which obliges companies with more than 3,000 employees to fulfill obligations of this law, and to be even more diligent and compliant in the supply chain. In our survey conducted by the German Chambers of Commerce and Industry, 23% of those companies told us right at the beginning of this year that they plan to withdraw from higher risk markets due to insecurities related to that law. So with this question, how can we ensure that this law is not a hurdle for trade? I would like you, dear Mr. Annen, here at stage and give your keynote. Yeah? Thank you for having you.
Well, hello. It's a great pleasure to be here, Mr. Dreyer, Mr. Bingman, and thank you very much for the introduction. Your remarks did not really came as a surprise for me, I have to say. And I can assure you that I have been equipped with some few good arguments. And I will come back to the question of the supply chain law, the Lieferketten-Sorgfaltsgesetz, of course, because it has been a topic of debate between the German companies, the association, and also the previous German government. We just had a little bit of a strange debate in the German parliament, because what is now the major opposition party, the Christian Democrats, who joined my party, the Social Democrats, where we were the junior partner in the previous government, when we passed that law, they immediately finding themselves in a new role attacking the law that they self have been passed. So it seems that the discussion is not over. And as it is leading now towards a European debate, I very much welcome the invitation and the request for having a continued exchange. As I promised, I will come back to the topic, but maybe let me address a few thoughts about the current situation. And I really wanted to start, before we get into maybe also a controversial debate, I really wanted to start thanking you, the German businesses, the international chamber represented here, for what has been a remarkable year that is behind us now. And I think if I would have been telling you a year from today, or a year ago, that we would be managing our economy with de facto zero Russian gas and almost no Russian oil, and that the German economy would have been able to substitute for that in record time, that we went through this winter without shortages in energy supply. Probably nobody really would have believed that that would have been possible in such short number of weeks and months. And I'm not an impartial observer here, of course, but I think we took some crucial and good decisions in the German government. But without the resources and the willingness and ability to adapt also to risky changes in the policies of companies represented here, the resilience of the German economic model, we would not have been able to make it. So I really wanted to thank you, and
And I believe the questions you raised towards the question, how are we dealing with a new megatrend, which is a trend towards protectionism? What does it mean for the German business model that has been criticized, and we had our debates with our partners, but also inside the country, of course. But nevertheless, I think over the last decades proved to be extremely successful and is and remains a pillar for Germany's prosperity and economic strength. We are in a time where we need to ask the hard questions. And for a politician to talk about diversification is easy. To implement a strategy is the hard work that lays ahead of us. And the German government's different ministries, I'm not representing the Ministry of the Economy here, but the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. But we are working hand in hand and closely together. We are conducting policies together, and I think we need to have that close discussion between government and German businesses. And there are many decisions coming up in the next weeks and months. The German government is in the process of concluding the drafting process of a national security strategy. Once that has been published, we are going to continue working on regional strategies, and maybe not surprising for you here in the room and those who are following us online is that the question of the upcoming China strategy will receive a lot of attention, as it is directly affecting also the export-driven German economic model. And I think, Mr. Bingman, you mentioned the question of, or was it Mr. Troyer? I don't know. But you mentioned the question of decoupling and the tense relationship between the United States and China. And we are already also seeing that having an impact, of course, on German-Chinese and European-Chinese relationship. I don't want to change the subject here, but I think it's necessary to make some comments about the general outlook that we are facing. There is no doubt that those systems were not based on rule of law, on the sound democracy, have been able, especially China in the last years, to develop a non-democratic but still very extremely successful economic model, where also we have been participating. And I believe it's necessary to make steps in the direction of diversification, but we also need to be realistic about what can be achieved in a short-term process. There is sometimes, I think, some illusions about the question what Germany can do to become immune or independent of the threats and the uncertainties that we are facing. There's no easy solution, but there's certainly the need for what you called communication, and that's what we are doing. And it's also affecting the work in our ministry, by the way, because, and that's when I'm approaching a little bit the question of the supply chain law. What we are seeing right now is that the economic impact of the corona crisis, which in Germany is largely seen as overcome, is still affecting our partner countries, the developing countries, in a very, very harsh manner. So now we have an additional crisis. We see that Russia's war of aggression is adding to the global tensions. And there's a concern around there that we are turning away from, especially the developing countries, that we turn away our attention, our resources, our focus. Why am I mentioning that? Because we as a government, we can use our instruments, the well-proved instruments, for example, of development cooperation, And we are doing that. We are investing in those countries. We are engaging with them to improve living conditions, to address basic needs. But if you look at the numbers of the needs, if you look at the data of the United Nations organization, the immense need for investment is something that a government cannot address alone. We cannot finance alone with taxpayers' money what needs to be invested. So we need to cooperate. We need private businesses to invest, also in difficult and risky markets. I don't see any alternative to that. So instead of looking at the new supply chain law as a hurdle for investment, and Mr. Dreyer, of course, if you are reporting that 23% of the companies you ask are considering, withdrawing from those regions, we should have a conversation about that. And what are their individual motivations to give such an answer, which, of course, is not a good news for us. But we rather see that law and the instruments that we are providing to help companies to comply with the new regulations as an incentive, as a help for long-term investment and partnerships with those countries. Why is that? First of all, we all know how fragile supply chains are today. And that is true for the big players, China and others, but it's also true for very specific products and resources, natural resources that we need, also from some of our BMZ's partner countries. So establishing reliable market relations, I think that's one of the key pillars for future sustainable strategy. But there's at least another very important aspect, and that has to do with discussions here in our home markets. I'm also talking, about the reputational aspect of those engagements. German and increasingly European customers want to know, is the product that I'm purchasing related to child work, to forced labor, to violations of human rights? And I think that we can give a clear answer. So the supply chain law helps German and hopefully in future also European companies to make a clear statement towards also their own customers and giving them the opportunity to strengthen their market position. So I believe it's the right thing to do. I really regret a little bit that a broad consensus that we had been able to build during the times of what we call the Great Coalition seems to be evaporating a little bit, but we don't give up on that. We want to maintain that consensus. And I still have a lot to mention here, but I want to conclude maybe with one thought. If you look at the level of integration of developing countries in the international markets, you will see that the least developed countries, the poorest of the poor, make only about 1% of the share of global trade. 1%. That's unsustainable. It's not only unfair, but it's unsustainable. And we are seeing that entire regions in Africa, for example, the Sahel region, are in danger of disintegrating. State structures are disintegrating. Organized crime, international terrorism is spreading. We see how vulnerable countries are towards pressure. But we are right now have to be very clear. We are seeing pressure being applied by Russia towards Mali, for example, and other countries. We have far too little private investment in those regions. And I'm not accusing anybody here in the room. Don't get me wrong. Conditions are very, very difficult. Security is not guaranteed. Return of investment remains with a question mark. The framework is sometimes unclear. So it means that we need to make a joint effort to enable us together to make a more sustained investment, especially in the LDCs. That means also we need to strengthen international organizations like the World Trade Organization. But we are at the same time not naive. We know that those processes take time. And so we do both. We invest in strengthening international regulations, but we also make a joint effort for agreements like the Mercosur agreement, for example. I know that's controversial, also within the German public. We saw that with Canada, which took us, I think, 6 or 7 years to get to the ratification. We cannot afford that repetition of what we saw with CETA, with Mercosur, because it's giving us an opportunity to implement some of the standards and to generate some of the predictability that we need to attract private investment. But it gives us also an opportunity to implement global human rights standards that are also reflected in the supply chain law. So I think there are many pillars on where we can approach our joint goal, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to address some of them here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Annen. I would like to bring on stage Mrs. Jansen. She is with the OECD. Mrs. Garza, she is with the ICC. Mr. Jürgen Lindenberg, he is our entrepreneur. Yeah? And last but not least, Dr. Christian Vorwig, he is with the Ministry of Economic Policy and Climate Action. Please give them a great hand of applause. If you don't mind, I would like to start with Jürgen Lindenberg, because he's the man who is the entrepreneur, yeah? And we have in mind, and I don't want to put you wrong, Mr. Annen. I really appreciate what you have said, that we have fragile supply chains. I mean, I don't appreciate, but it is like it is. We need to turn to stick to risky markets. The less developed the market is, the greater is the likelihood that it is also a risky market. And the least developed countries add only 1% to global trade. And we have our observation, if we just stick for the moment to this, because it's one example of a regulation. And the title is "The More the Better?" ? And one regulation, at least from a German perspective, but there's also a European proposal in the discussion when it comes to the due diligence law or supply chain act. So the first example is the German version, or it's a, in the meantime, well-known example. Jürgen, do you know this law? And your company is really provides, the company is named Lindy. Your name is Jürgen Lindenberg, so that's easy to see. Yeah, the proximity to your last name. It provides digital solutions and connectivity products in over 90 countries worldwide. So how did the Due Diligence Act impact your business, and how do you react?
First, it's about 50 countries, not over.
50?
Yeah.
Okay, but you will manage it, yeah. You're aiming for 90.
We're aiming at all. Yeah. It impacted us in a way that we got letters from our larger customers or from large customers of customers. Those who fall under the law means they have 3,000 employees or more. We have in Europe about 140, 80 in Germany. So the law does not apply to us in the first step. However, we got from those to whom it applied, we got letters to provide details or asked for auditing of our suppliers, our factories, etc., etc. And that was quite some work to do this, and it is further work to not only confirm that we are in the process of doing audits, for example, but also that we did them in some time in the future. So there is one lady who does this half day working, nothing else but handling the supply chain requests.
Mm-hmm. So do you have the expectation that it might be a boost for diversification, or is it just like it seems a new burdensome regulation which even prevents you from working with some markets?
Well, there are some good thoughts behind it. However, if Germany stays the only country, or even if the EU stays the only region who does it, it's useless. We have to convince the entire world, or the majority of the world, to have something like this law. Otherwise, there will be always holes and ways. People who are trading always find a way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Mr. Anne, do you want to react? I mean, I've written here down on my paper, yeah, not in my digital item, what I do have also, but communication, yeah. I have personally some examples for a communication with markets which are, to my knowledge, risky markets, and they think that behind this type of, or this special this supply chain law, there is not only good intention. This is a complaint or a kind of an accusation towards us, yeah, that the law is another type of, or might be another type of protectionism, that we do not really want to have those kind of added value done in a lesser developed market to bring in the global supply chains where our companies are working in. What do you have the same experience? And if not, what would you answer them?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. I'm encouraged by what you are saying, looking at the global perspective. Of course, that should be our goal. And in an ideal world, we would not have had the need to have a discussion about the implementation of basic labor standards and human rights questions. But we are in a time where the question of our values are being discussed quite frequently, also with regard to the geopolitical tensions, I think, that you also mentioned. So it's also a question of credibility for Germany, and I also believe for the European Union. But to come back to the concrete question, I had both experiences. I had discussion with government representatives who were suspicious about a new de facto trade barrier. But I also, and that very impressed me, had experience, for example, when a couple of years ago I visited Bangladesh and Pakistan, where also important German companies are importing textiles. And I think you all remember the incidents that we saw in those countries, in production sites that were not adequately secured for the living conditions, where we had fires, where people lost their lives. So I don't want to name them, but very recognizable brands also in Germany, even before we had the decision about a law, took the decision to make an investment in their supply chains, because their customers didn't want to have anything to do with products that originated from those sites where I visited them. Unacceptable working conditions. And the trade unions on the ground were struggling and fighting for better working conditions. So I think the investments that those companies made, they were very important, because they were an investment also in the creation and building of trust among their own customers. And if you have a very recognizable brand, it's also a reputational risk if you receive products in your supply chain from that low quality. And I want to be you have been very frank, I want to be very frank. I was among those in the previous government in favor of having a regulation based on voluntary measures. But it didn't work. And we had, I was the Minister of State in the Foreign Office, and we were responsible for a big survey, I think with more than 5,000 companies. So we had very detailed replies. And so the plea that was made to make sure that the supply chains are in order, that was not the result of the survey that we had. So I think, unfortunately, there was a need to have a law. We now have a law. And no law is set into stone. We will have discussions like the discussion today. We will look what is working, what is not working. Please hold us accountable also, because we made promises in terms of service offers to the companies. But sorry, I'm talking too long, but sticking with Pakistan and Bangladesh, we opened our markets with the GSP Plus instrument, and it was a boost for the exports from those companies, from those countries. And they knew that one condition was to make improvements in the supply chain. So I'm sure if you talk with colleagues from Pakistan, they will tell you, one priority is maintaining the GSP Plus standard, and we are helping them in doing just that.
Okay, thank you, Niels Ahnen. Sorry for the ladies here at the podium. It's a bit a specific German discussion which relates to globalization and international division of labor, but I do want to complete this German version of our debate today with Christian Vorweg first, before I hand over to you. Another observation, and Niels Ahnen, he said, hope I put you right, that you are in favor of Mercosur, yes, right? And free trade agreement. And another anecdote I have to add here is that I've discussed the process of the development of the text which is at the table and which is now, due to, I don't know, German concerns, is at stake. Niels Ahnen is in favor. We have heard of the German Chancellor. He's also in favor. The Greens are also in favor with some preconditions. And the preconditions are that we need more strict sanctions when it would come to the standard violations in the sustainability chapter, if I put it right. So, and the negotiator from the Brazilian side, I had the chance to discuss with him, and he said that in the meantime, the conclusion of the text and now there are 2 years in the meantime have passed away, so to say, and that in the meantime the European Union introduced already sanctions unilaterally via the Deforestation Act, an import ban on products which are done on land where have been a forest prior to this, to the production, and the Human Rights Violation Act, and also the German due diligence law, the CBAM, the taxonomy, etc., unilaterally. This is a complaint and also an accusation from that side. So I don't know how many billion-dollar question it would be. Will there be a conclusion? Yeah, or have you ever heard of such accusations from the other side?
Yes, certainly we did. Thank you for the question.
He's the expert. He's our man of trade in the Ministry of Economy.
I was told I get the easy question, but this is a difficult question. But let me perhaps put this into a broader context a little bit, where we are on the Mercosur agreement and also with the due diligence law and what was discussed before, and also with regard to your title, the more the better regulation. I think you have basically two possibilities to do your regulation. The one is on the multilateral level, and the one is on the bilateral level. And on the multilateral level, of course, this is a different story. But here on the bilateral level, we are trying to do free trade agreements, or building up our free trade agenda with several countries within Mercosur as well. Mercosur, the agreement was politically finalized in 2019, and you're right, since then things have developed. We have a different world, we have a different perspective on China, we had the Russian war, we have a different geopolitical view to the world as well. And what we are trying to do is to do regulation and to find ways of trade regulation with our partners. We see Mercosur region as one of our partners. It is very close to us. It is geo-economically very much important, geopolitically also, to not lose this whole part of the world, this very important part of the world, to China or to autocratic systems, while China is very much an important player in this region. They are the most important trading partner for the whole region there, and they are one of the most important investment partners. And what China does is offering a trade relations of a different quality. What we are trying to do is to have trade relations, but on a high level of quality, with a lot of trade and investment that also is in the need of those countries and useful for them, because German companies usually and European companies, they come to stay. They don't come to get raw materials out of this region and process them elsewhere. They want to do it on place, and this is why we have several pieces of legislation out to guarantee this quality of trade and to also ensure the constituencies here in Germany and in Europe what we are really doing there. So in this context, it fits the regulation you mentioned on deforestation, for example, because we care very much about the natural resources in Brazil and in other areas of this region. Also, the due diligence law, I think, is part of this thinking, that we want to do trade, but we want to have respect for the human rights, for labor rights, for environmental rights. And we want to make sure that this takes place. And this is the way we are also talking to the Mercosur partners and explaining them what we want to do and if they share these values. And we get the answer, yes, they share these values. Yeah. The question is really about how can we technically implement this? Is it going up to a point where we need some kind of reliability that everybody takes care of this, what we want? And we've seen it in Brazil during the time of Bolsonaro, that even the Brazilian laws who are there to protect the environment and the forest are not followed. So we need some kind of assurance. And this is where at least my minister and the Green part of the government comes in, but I think the Social Democrats are very on a like-minded way to see how do we get these insurances. And there are different models. One model is to operate with sanctions, and in fact we've more than 6 different options to do this now. And I'm quite sure that also our partners in Mercosur, because they see the same problems, they are quite open to this discussion. So we had very good talks in the last weeks. We have regular talks. Not only the Commission, also the German government is very active here, and we get a sense that this is in the intention of both parties.
It is in the intention of the other partner that they are getting likely to be sanctioned?
No, I think the kind of red line I would see there is if we would have a kind of sanctions model that affects the sovereignty of a different state. If we, for example, to exaggerate, but this is not what we want here, yeah. But in their view, if we would go here from the European part and look, you in Brazil or in Argentina, we help you to force in your own laws. If not, you're getting sanctioned. This is crossing a red line for sure.
I have heard that they demand a price for that. And that one price could be, and this was envisaged by our Minister Habeck, that there might be a lesser opening up of the procurement market in Brazil. So yes. This would be the price.
It's not the price. I would call it reciprocity. And reciprocity is a question you always have if you negotiate. If you make a proposal, you get a counter-proposal, of course. There is no official counter-proposal, as to my knowledge now, from the Mercosur side, but we're expecting one in April now. But it might be the case, yes. That's one of the issues this is floating around. Why not look at procurement markets? But as you know, and this is no mystery, the Mercosur countries are looking very much on the agricultural side as well. They have their offensive interests to export agriculture, and there is an agreement there. And there might be perhaps other issues they would like to see there. But as far as I understand the negotiations taking place so far, there's no will from no side to reopen what has been concluded in 2019. I didn't see any attempt to reopen these negotiations. No, not from their side, not from our side. So we are in between. We are really in the part of fine-tuning, looking at what has happened in the last 4 years. Deforestation regulation, due diligence, CBAM, you mentioned all the kind of legislation here on the European side, but many things happened also on the Mercosur side. And we are doing this fine-tuning to find the right balance to conclude this agreement as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, and sorry for being so provocative, but this agreement from the perspective of German internationally oriented industry is of utmost importance, and therefore, there's the need to be frank and clear on that. Thank you. Marion Jansen, you are Director for Trade and Agriculture, and maybe that is a good bridge to you, the discussion about also the market for agricultural goods. Between Mercosur and Europe, or the potential for that, but maybe you can briefly describe the state of play when it comes to international trade in general. I mean, we discuss here the more regulation, the more the better question mark, and behind that you can find an intention of the German international business that we are aiming for more trade, more better trade, of course, but the state of play looks less bright and more gloomy, at least from our perspective. One finding of our many surveys, we are bothering companies like Linde day by day almost, we are also an initiator of red tape, admittedly, but is that a record high of German companies who are working abroad are confronted with new regulations, a record high. And we have at the same time relatively low growth rates in world trade and also in German exports. From your perspective, how would you assess the general state of play world trade relates?
Thank you for that question, and I will maybe try to bring that question back to the discussion you had, because this German due diligence law is not a German thing. This is something we discuss in Paris at the OECD as part of a bigger picture. For those of you who do not know the OECD, we are an international organization based in Paris, and we have 38 members. And those members consider themselves like-minded. They do not always agree, but they consider themselves like-minded. What they have in common is that they are democracies. Most European Union countries are members. We have a number of members in the Asia-Pacific region, Australia, Korea, Japan, and in the Americas, United States, Mexico, Canada, and a few others. I do not know exactly the history of the due diligence guidelines of Germany, but I do know that we have for many years had due diligence guidelines at the OECD, and I think actually that the language of your legal text is based on those due diligence guidelines. Those due diligence guidelines are voluntary. Germany has made them mandatory. I've looked at the German legal text. It doesn't make reference to the OECD guidelines, but when you look at the current legal text of the EU, it makes explicit reference to the OECD text. So therefore, your due diligence guidance are closely linked to something 38 other countries and more, because countries like Morocco have subscribed to these guidelines, already know. And I would like to propose to you to use this already as a strategic starting point, because you mentioned, Mr. Lindenberg, more countries should work like we do. That would make it easier for us. Well, there are already over 38 countries that know these kind of guidelines. They do not make them mandatory, but they are familiar with them. So I would like to invite you and your European colleagues to come to Paris and talk to those countries. Because if you have to negotiate your next agreement, be it with Mercosur or with others, and you have to pay prices in the negotiations, you will find that negotiation easier, as you said, if more countries can proceed as you are doing. And that's actually very much an idea behind the new trade strategy, as we call it, that we are working on at the OECD, where we are looking at what does the world look like right now, and what does that mean for trade. What we do see is indeed that there is a big decoupling narrative being used. We start to see it in the data, that China is trading less with OECD members, trading more with the Asian region, or sourcing more domestically. And we are seeing in Europe, but also in the United States, a whole portfolio of new regulations, laws, be they CHIPS Acts, Investment Screening Acts, CBAMs, Inflation Reduction Acts, Forced Labor Acts, one after the other, coming up that will not make trade between China and Europe and the United States easier. What the trade strategy proposes at the OECD as a thought is to consider, to look at sustainability standards in a strategic way. Now, when you discuss these standards in the due diligence guidance in the previous governments, you may have thought of them as, you were thinking of them as something that will enhance sustainability. We were thinking of this with an objective of environmental or social sustainability. What we propose in our strategic discussion is to look at them from a geo-economic point of view. If you are looking for new partners, if you are looking to diversify in a different way, and I say you to Germany, I'm German myself, but I'm not saying you, if Germany, our members are looking at that, you have to decide with whom are you going to trade more, to whom are you going to diversify. Now, you say less with authoritarian regimes, not always easy to define either. But rather than being negative and exclusive, why not saying trade more with those who are willing to work with us on the basis of our common standards, based on common values. And the due diligence guidance could be the type of standard that you already have in place. That's a positive way to look at a new trade agenda, one that builds a different quality of trade around joint standards and is open to others. It's not excluding others, but is open to others. The difficulty will be, as Mr. Anand said, to implement it. Because you will, in certain types of countries, in particular in the developing world, have to help countries, help companies to meet those standards. And you also have to be aware of something else. Those countries are not considering themselves anymore recipients of development aid. They will be happy to receive it, but they are very aware of the fact that there are multiple geo-economic players who want to do business with them. Germany and European Union are only one of them. You will more and more have to speak to them eye to eye.
Mm. Thank you, Mrs. Janssen. We will continue and resume this discussion. But I would like to hand over, before I hand over to Mrs. Gasser, once again to Niels Anand, because he is in urgent and then he has to leave or maybe we are also across your red line you gave us, 4:00 p.m. One last question to you, and what Mrs. Janssen has said, more trade and incentivizing more trade with, I describe it with like-minded partners in the region you are more responsible for. Might be that there are not so many when it comes to governance, compliance standards, the society in terms of democracy, etc., such kind of like-minded partners. Or at least there might be other partners from the world, China, who are already there. And at the same time, sorry, that's also a German discussion, once again, you are curbing down the means for the cooperation with the business sector in your ministry. So how does this fit? Sorry, we wanted to be frank here.
And we should, I appreciate that, and I'm sorry I jumped in for my colleague, State Secretary Flassbart, and my schedule is a bit tight. But thanks for the question. And I think what the last point you mentioned, and by the way, we are maintaining the level of the funding. We had additional money because of the corona crisis and the immediate needs. But I would wish to maintain that even additional standard. So with the support of the powerful German businesses associations, I think we will have a very strong argument in the ongoing budget negotiations. But I believe you just made a very strong argument for the German Development Cooperation. Because the name of my ministry is Economic Cooperation and Development. We believe that needs to go hand in hand. And for good reasons, we had a lot of discussions now about the due diligence law, the supply chain law. But we have been developing a lot of instruments working with German companies in developing countries. I'm the chair of the supervisory committee of KfW DIHK, which is enhancing private investment in sometimes very difficult markets. We have, with a strong focus on Africa, developed very, very well functioning instruments. And we need to increase that. Also because of the geopolitics that we cannot ignore. But there's one point that I would like to make. With most of our partner countries, we have engaged over many, many years. We have I pick Mali as an example. Very difficult situation right now. The junta voted with the Russians in the General Assembly. There was, in a way, a surprise. We expected abstention. It was a clear provocation, and it caused some reaction here. But would it, from our point of view, be the right decision to cut all the relationship right now? Certainly not. We are not the foreign ministry, which is a great ministry. I served there. But, you know, our focus is on the long-term development relation. And that gives us sometimes the ability also to talk about difficult questions with the governments who are not always democratic. In fact, every time less so. To understand their point of view, but also to make our point, value-based policy point. And if we are going to be backed up by the willingness and ability of the German companies to invest with the conditions that we both need to work on, it's going to have an impact. Maybe not on the next vote in the General Assembly, but maybe in 5 or 10 years. The Chinese that have been mentioned here, they have developed long-term strategies with a real impact. We need to learn to think more in the long term. And the exchange with the German businesses is important. I think to put an emphasis on our value-based policies is the right thing to do in times of tensions. But we can work with countries also on supply chain questions and more investment, also who are not necessarily democratic countries. And if you ask your members, what are the countries in Asia they are looking for, diversify their China portfolio, you maybe find India, and hopefully so, but you probably also find a country like Vietnam. By the way, a country that Germany has a very long-lasting development cooperation program in spite of policy differences. And they're very eager to keep the European markets open, and they are listening to us when we are talking about standards. So I think that's the right approach. And we are very used to talking to governments and regimes who are not sharing our point of view, but understand that lifting up the economic activities, prosperity, is in our shared interest, because otherwise we will not be able to cope with the fragility and the failing states and the effects that we are all witnessing and that you are all witnessing when you take your investment decisions. I apologize for having to leave, you know, but I really appreciate this dialogue, and I'm sorry that I could not listen to you, but I hope we find another time to repeat that. Yeah, danke schön.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahnen. We are grateful for having had you here. Maria Fernanda Garza, sorry for letting wait you so long. She's chair of the ICC and CEO of the Mexican company, Mexico. We like Mexico. Great trading partner for the German business, by the way, the company Orestia. Mrs. Garza, international rules play an undisputable role on the level of the ICC. We now turn more to a multilateral perspective. Regarding our guiding question, the more the better, regulating international trade, where do you think is regulation of international trade necessary, or where is it and might be also an obstacle to trade?
Well, as a starting point, I need to go to one of ICC's founding principles, which is we believe very much in auto-regulation. And the Incoterms is a great example of that. You know, the Incoterms, international commercial terms that we all use in our businesses every day, are created by the users of the trade. And they are upgraded every 10 years in a very kind of simple process. If we have to go through legislative procedures in countries, we will still be using probably the Incoterms of the 1970s. So this is great. that autoregulation really works, and this is a great example. But I think that we also have to recognize and even accept that the dominant paradigm in trade today is now one of having more regulation. And I think that there's no doubt that the regulation really works. We have a very good example during the 1980s on how the world was able to regulate the emission of gases that were harming the ozone layer. And in the 1980s, we were very, very effective in regulating. But I do see an issue with the sorts of requirements that are now being placed into trade agreements by the EU and the United States as well. And how can we expect businesses, and particularly small businesses, to have the capacity on the resources to comply? And basically what you were saying to the minister, and I did like what he said. I mean, I think that he's a tone of what we need, but we still are facing the factor that if we don't do it right, the developing countries, will end up just trading among yourselves. Because you mentioned this more than 20% of companies in Germany that are already looking to get out of some markets because they are not sure that they will be able to comply with these new regulations. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we expect emerging markets to comply with these important standards if we do not develop not only the mechanisms but also the financial support that companies in these markets will need to be able to comply? And this is a matter of grading gradually, because you have been working on these issues for more than 20 years. And you cannot expect that companies that are in the very early stages and do want to comply with both human rights and sustainability issues, but they have to develop the capacity and they have to have access, particularly the SMEs, to the finance to doing so. So that, I mean, we basically agree on what he said, but we need to go deeper into how we're going to achieve it.
With this, I have to bring in Christian Vorwig once again. Because I couldn't agree more to what Mrs. Garza has said, that we have to avoid, if I put you right, that at the end of the day we are trading only with ourselves. And a bit, Mrs. Janssen is in favor of trading with ourselves. She are, okay. But this is more, it sounds nice, friendshoring, yeah, where doing trade and investments with friends. But it does not sound so nice if we end up in only with. How can we avoid this?
Yes, well, first of all, let me assure you that, of course, it's policy of the German government to do whatever we have as regulations to have it as less burdensome, as less bureaucratic as possible here, and to give those companies who are in need really help to do this. Yeah, one issue is that we have at one of our agencies at the BAFA was responsible for this due diligence law to have employees helping the companies affected here and give them help by help desks, by digital means and other possibilities. Then there is, of course, we have to mention the threshold we have. It's companies, you mentioned companies in the very early stages. I think the threshold is, by the moment, is 3,000 employees. That's perhaps not in the very early stage. And then the threshold coming from next year is 1,000 employees as minimum. So we have a confidence that these companies might be in a position to do so. And what I get from those people responsible for this legislation in the ministry is there will be flexibility also when they answer this the questions and so on. So there's a way to do so. A part of that, I certainly see the fact. I see that that companies active in developing countries might have more difficulties. I've read of, for example, building companies active in Africa that think to withdraw because they don't overlook all the subsidiary sub-companies working for them. This is a real difficulty, and we need to work together with the BMZ and others, the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development and others active to get this overview. That's part of the deal. Nevertheless, as I explained before, the idea behind is this to have a very high quality trade, and this includes the respect for human rights and other things, environment, even animal welfare and so on. It's not only trade against we deliver a car and you deliver a cow or something. It's more, yeah. And this is the intention behind, and we try to do this. Not to forget the OECD at this stage, because we are very much perhaps not mentioning the OECD in the legislation, but very much looking on the work done by the OECD in this context.
Yeah. Please give the mic to Jürgen Lindenberg. One distinction in what Marion Jansen has said was a voluntary or a mandatory necessity to agree on standards. Yeah? And as far as I've learned, the OECD guidelines are voluntary guidelines. The German law is mandatory. Why have you, as a representative of an SME, yeah, hesitated so long that you agreed for yourself or to have shown it to the government or whatever, yeah, and created maybe a reputational risk. Yeah, this is also a concern. Yeah, okay. I raised this question and I have the answer. You're not a label, unfortunately, not yet proceeded like the ones who are always in the eyes of every consumer in Germany. But what do you say when you have this distinction between voluntary and the mandatory version? Was there the need for the mandatory version? I mean, this would be an answer to what Niels Annen has said.
If you're a government, then you always want mandatory rules because you want to follow up if they really do it, and you want to punish people if they don't do it. However, there's one fail in thinking about this, especially the supply chain law. It's not always a market where the customer can dictate the rules. We have very often the case that we must be grateful that they supply us. And then when I come with the paper and say, please sign that you follow this rule and do this and that, and for the German supply chain rule, they turn around and say, okay, go buy somewhere else. This is fact.
Mm-hmm. And who are your main competitors as customer?
Competitors who do the same they do the same
as customer, yeah, for the same supplier.
Yeah, they come from the biggest one is from Canada with the US market.
But it's sometimes stated that other markets. I yesterday watched a TV show between Franziska Brandner, the parliamentary state secretary. We assumed that she will be here today, and a representative of the German business sector, Mr. Zander. And Mrs. Brandner said that the United States have even stricter rules when it comes to mandatory due diligence aspects. This is what she stated yesterday night in Phoenix. Yeah, might be that I'm the only one who have watched this show. Yeah, but this is that she stated. So your competitors in Canada, they don't have the same mandatory rules and they are more free.
I can't say it for sure because I don't know, but we don't feel it. We buy largely from the same suppliers. We're in the electronic business. Our main products are cables that you all have on your desk here or on your desk in your office. And we come across our competitors from the Chinese. It's 100% Chinese suppliers. We come across our competitors there, and they don't request the rules we request. Whether they're flying under the radar or they don't have them, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And an additional question to you, Jürgen. Niels Annen mentioned India. This is, I would say, a real one elephant here in the room, obviously, is China, and the other potential elephant when it comes to a larger share of international trade and attracting international capital is often named India. Why aren't you in India like you are in China?
Two aspects. One is selling, one is buying. We sell to India, but there is nobody where we can buy from. As I said, this business is 100% in China. There are cable factories in Vietnam. There's even one in India, but they buy all the parts in China.
Mm-hmm. And Christian, I cannot leave you out here without saying a word to a potential free trade agreement, European Union with India. Are you? Is the level of optimism the same like with Mercosur?
There's always optimism, but if you ask for the level of optimism, I would agree. First, India is a very special market. It's not comparable to Mercosur. It's a market. It's a place where we have long-standing negotiations, and they led to nothing in the past. They were suspended for a couple of years. They are now coming up again, and we give it a try again from the EU because we have a major interest in India. India is a huge market with a huge potential, but very much depends also on the Indian side if they really want a trade agreement. And I'm personally not so sure about their intentions, but at least from the European side, I think we would welcome very much to have some kind of free trade agreement. Although I think we all agree it's not one size fits all over the world. We are not applying the same size to every economy. Here we have a very different economy. We have different negotiations and much more difficult negotiations than with Latin America. That's my momentary view.
India brings me always to the WTO. Maria Fernanda Garza, you have mentioned, you have thrown in the regulation, the voluntary regulation of Incoterms. Do you see any light, any silver lining in WTO, in multilateral rules when it comes to the topic of sustainability? Or maybe you bring us a silver lining to the WTO in general. I would very much appreciate.
Well, first of all, I think that it's important that we don't talk down the organization too much. Because even though it's true that the paralysis of the appellate body is a major blow, its rules are still vital for trade today. So we need to continue pushing forward on this. And in order to strengthen the organization, we need to see a shift on political approach. And it will depend if the US, China, and the European Union can compromise on contentious issues. And to get there, I think that we as business have to become more vocal and convey to our governments the importance that the WTO has for businesses. Because at the end of the day, governments place the frameworks, but the ones that conduct the trade is us. And we as of today, we never had enough to say at the organization. So that's something that really needs to change. I very much agree with what the minister said, or secretary, about the importance of business and governments working together in order to solve today's challenges. But not only from the financial point of view, because sometimes we are only seen as business community as a blank check to cover the financing of projects. We also have to we can bring to the table all our creativity, our innovation, which is what we need to solve the problems. So we definitely need to work together, and the WTO is a great example of that.
Mm-hmm. From the WTO to the OECD, Marion Jansen, there is not only, so in Germany, we summarize maybe the discussion we do have with 3 keywords. One keyword is decarbonization, and this brings me to the idea of a climate club. Maybe that's more than just one discussion worth to lead, maybe later on or whenever. The other is diversification, and then we have resilience. And resilience is often very close connected to a new type of industrial policy. And not a horizontal one, but a more vertical one. And this brings me to the IRA. And maybe to the proposal of a Raw Material Act in Europe, to the idea of a Net Zero Industry Act, Europe. From your perspective, how do you assess this development?
Well, maybe I should add a bit of history to my own life. I worked for many years for the WTO. So with that in the back of my mind, I observed this with a lot of concern. Right? We are doing now things that 15 years ago I would have considered impossible. The word industrial policy, when I was at the WTO, that was nearly blasphemy. We were not allowed to pronounce that. Now it's becoming fashionable again. So that, I have to stretch my intellectual agility a bit in this period. No, I'm looking at this entire combination of new legislations. I mentioned them before. And I'm looking at this very generous use of government funding in the economies with concern, because we are more and more moving into a situation where government is very active in private economies. And we were arguing that our economies have in common at the OECD that they are market-led economies. And that's what we consider to be the big difference with China. And that was one of the concerns we had with China. China is an economy where the government intervenes a lot, where the government gives a lot of money to companies. So when we move in the same direction, it's a bit of concern. I have another concern when it comes to the WTO. That's a German concern. In Germany, you speak a lot about the WTO, the importance of the WTO. The government is a strong supporter of the WTO, yet the due diligence, the mandatory due diligence law creates a national jurisprudence system around possible trade disputes. Isn't that the beginning of a further weakening of the WTO dispute settlement system? There's not a lot of discussion about this, but I think that would definitely not be intended, but there is a risk of this. So I'm looking at these things, these developments with concerns. I repeat the plea I had before. At least do not hurt each other among OECD countries. And we just heard from Mr. Lindenberg an example. He cannot buy from a supplier because the supplier needs to fill in forms that the supplier doesn't need to fill in for a Canadian company. Yet that the Canadian government will say, I'm like-minded with Germany. We have a similar approach when it comes to trading with values. So I invite you to at least enlarge the family beyond Germany, beyond the European Union, and talk as much as possible about what you can do together among like-minded democratic countries and then from there, enlarge, have an engagement with other countries around your common values. But if in a current situation, either with subsidies or with due diligence guidance or with CBAMs, we are hurting each other within the OECD family, I don't think that that puts us as democratic countries in a good position to negotiate with non-democratic countries.
Thank you. Now I got your point with what I labeled with friendshoring. Yeah? We would be very much in favor of having such kind of level playing field for our customers with customers of like-minded partners having the same obligation or voluntary standard. Would be even prefer, of course, but please raise your hand if you have a question now, but I will come back to you anyway. If not now, then I would like to ask Christian Vorwig once again, although it's not in his responsibility, what is your take on this new type of industrial policy? I personally could not agree more to what Marion Jansen has said, and I know that your ministry, the ministry you are working for, is working on a German industrial plan.
Yes. Yes.
Or do you bring in that we avoid any local content regulation which is comparable and reciprocal to the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yes, well, you're completely right. First of all, I share everything what Marion said on in industrial policy and the developments. And I think in an ideal world, it would be the case that the family of the OECD agrees on something, and we discuss this. But that's where politics come in, of course. I'm not a politician, and I regret that Franziska Brandner is not sitting in my place here. I think she could answer this more credible than I do. But I'm long enough in government to see how politicians react here, and politicians react the way they bring out due diligence laws or industrial policy acts, and it's a kind of answer to what others do, of course, and everybody wants to be the first one to react, of course. And with regard to the IRA, of course, when the IRA came out in August last year, we had some very serious faces here in the German government looking at this legislation. Not because this legislation is intended as a good part to do the energy transformation, everybody applauds that the US is doing a lot here, but because of the local content part of it. The local content part and the danger for our companies and the threat from companies we faced immediately. Why? We go to the US. There's a lot of subsidies out there, and we do better business there. And even more threat or more danger if we look at future developments that are not in place now, but future technologies. Where will they take place? In the US or here in Europe? So there's the need to give an answer, and this is why the government is developing this industrial plan or industrial policy, using its industrial policy that is already there to give incentives to those companies and those branches where the government considers them to be crucial for the future, for the energy transition process. And the same goes for semiconductors, for example. These are those where we have IPSIs and everything else in place. This is the policy behind it.
Mrs. Garza, you're an entrepreneur coming from Mexico, and what we've learned about the IRA is that Mexico and Canada, due to the US MCA, formerly known as NAFTA, you're a beneficiary or you have the exemption that you don't have to comply to these local content rules. How do you assess this new type of industrial policy, or is it a topic in Mexico at all?
Well, it started with a renegotiation of NAFTA with the USMCA, because the United States changed the content of origin laws for instance, for the automotive industry. And some German companies established in Mexico went through that. And they insisted on more products being labeled as with regional content from the US specifically. So that's when all of these discussions started. So now that we know we're exempted on this, there is not so much a discussion, and definitely Mexico is benefiting with this relocating of some industrial plants. And it is a great example that even though the Mexican government is not taking advantage of the opportunities regarding policy frameworks that are today in place, there is a lot of foreign investment coming to Mexico just because of the location where it has. And I just wanted to go back to what you mentioned about the level playing field, which is absolutely important, and what you also mentioned about how sometimes even me having a small company, I had to change vendors because they will not comply with the minimum requirements that we set to make sure that they are respecting sustainable or human rights issues. And that really puts me in a situation where I cannot compete with other companies, even in Mexico, where we do not have all of these kind of regulations. So for us, and for all the Latin American companies that I have talked to recently, which are very much expecting the development of the free trade agreement with Europe and with the European Union, and particularly with Germany, it is very important for us because of what was mentioned before. Other countries like China that are investing strongly in the region do not bring the same views and the same values to the table. The governments might be interested because they are having a very short vision of these kind of investments. But the business community is looking more into the long term and into establishing a partnership with European and in particularly with German companies that will be more sustainable. So I am very glad to hear that this is an issue that is very much on the table of the German business community and the government, because for the Latin American and in particular the Mercosur community, this is of absolute importance, and we really need you there.
Thank you, very much appreciated your contribution. So I have to apologize here. It's a cooling down period, what we are doing here, and Holger is wearing his scarf in the meantime. Yeah? I have a question. Oliver Wieck.
It's Mr. Vorwig, I want to refer to, I think, an initiative or a new approach of the EU trade policy, I think, which was initiated in fall last year, which different to the past, where sustainability chapters in foreign trade agreements were combined with support and advice coming from the EU to implement these chapters. There seems to be a new approach now where these chapters are combined if a partner country doesn't comply with some kind of sanctions, reducing the customs preferences and so on. I'm just wondering if what your personal opinion, or as a ministry which has been at least very much supporting this kind of approach, if you really think that in this new world after the Zeitenwende, where we are looking for strategic partners in the world, like India, like Mercosur, like other regions, if this approach is appropriate, and if you really think that this approach is going to be successful. Thank you.
Well, it's related to the communication on trade and sustainability last year of the European Commission, and in fact, the trade and sustainability part is very important. It's very important also for the German government, and we see it up to the point that this has to be reliable in some way. It's not only saying, well, we all want to be sustainable, and then later we don't do it. So we have different methods to do this. We have a process. We have even a mediation process we had in the past. We had the possibility to say you're not sustainable, then it goes to mediation, and the top would be that that if really somebody does something not sustainable, for example, tears down the rainforest or whatsoever, then we would have the possibility to withdraw trade preferences. And this has been accepted, for example, in the agreement with New Zealand. New Zealand, being at the same level as we are, they accepted this approach because they have a very similar view on this. But as I said before, we have to be careful here. Not every negotiation is the same. Not one size fits all. And we're currently negotiating with the Mercosur members, and it might be different. Of course, we are presenting them the same approach as we agreed with New Zealand, and we discuss about this. But what's more important is what's behind the approach. It's not important that the approach looks exactly the same as New Zealand, but the intention behind it. And on the intention, we see from the replies we get from the Mercosur negotiators that they share many of the views. The Latin Americans share the same values that we do for protection of environment, for social issues, for human rights issues, and then it's the question how to put it in a legal framework that it's binding for everybody. And there's the question we had before also on reciprocity. If they agree on something, what do we agree on our side? So this is the way of negotiating this. And another completely different question is what about India? What about Indonesia? Do they accept the same standards? Do we have to apply the same standards? I think at the end of the day, the agreements will be to some kind difference, but we will find solutions that fit to the specific agreement we are trying to negotiate.
If there is no other question right at the moment, I would turn to the topic decoupling. And maybe first question to that issue and this, so to say, elephant here in the room, China, it goes to Jürgen Lindenberg, because you work so close with a Chinese supplier you mentioned. Have they ever heard about our discussion leading here about, so in former times it was like this, yeah? A minister and even a German chancellor is heading to China, and the government airplane was full packed with German business representatives. In the meantime, we have to read a version of the China strategy coming from your ministry, Christian Vorwig. I guess you are not the author of this paper, but that it might be forbidden in the future that the German chancellor is meeting with a Chinese leader, prime minister, or even president, with the attendance of German business people. So just this as a kind of an impression. This is our discussion here in Germany, but it's also driven by the U.S. administration, the current one and the former one. How are your Chinese supplier? How do they receive and perceive this discussion, or do they not care, or do they care, or what?
This question comes about 4 weeks too early. I haven't been in China since December 2019, and these things are only discussed face to face, with phones switched off. But I will be there from around the Easter holidays for 2 weeks, and then you can ask me on the 17th of April.
Okay, then I hand over the same question to Mrs. Garza. And add that we know in the meantime that there are some dependencies and maybe some exaggerated discussions about dependency, Germany to China. It's our major trading partner, but at least it has not more than 9-point-something% of our overall trade volume. but nevertheless, in some cases, and when it comes to some products, it is critical. When we speak about energy transition, when we speak about mobility transition from combustion engine to e-mobility, and when we speak about issues we do need or items we do need for digitalization our economy. Do you have a comparable discussion in Mexico? And have you ever heard that your US counterparts are forcing you to divert from China?
No, not in that way.
Interesting.
Not forcing, but sometimes you don't need to force. You just have to put the right incentives on the table. So that is one of the main concerns that we have globally, that if the industrial policy, trade agreements start making particularly the developing countries choose among two different blocks, which is what basically it's forming here, and technology-driven blocks. Developing countries will have to choose where they will be standing for getting access to this technology, and that in some cases is even worse than forcing a country into something. And that is a very, very high risk that we see right now, precisely with all the policy that particularly the US has been bringing out in these days. And it is important to consider the situation of the companies in developing countries, in particularly SMEs, because we face different challenges than the ones you have in developing countries. One of them being access to trade finance, which is there's an enormous gap, and I feel it myself in my company, but also there are dozens of studies that prove that. And this is particularly more intense for women-owned enterprises in the developing world. So closing these trade finance gaps should be a major concern for the development priority of the global community. The second one, which surprised me that has not been brought in the discussion today, is the corruption and the rule of law. Not every country operates under the same conditions, and this is extremely damaging for the whole global community. This is an issue that both the G7 and the G20 countries should be putting more attention. We have international instruments, mechanisms, conventions that have proven not very successful, that are in need of an urgent update. And last year, we from ICC make a call to doing that, and no one single country supported us. So we will be doing the same this year, and we hope to bring around more countries. And the third one is domestic support. You have to remember that not all developing countries have the capacity to support their businesses, particularly now that subsidies through industrial policy and like in the United States as well, in the European Union, are coming along. These are going to be very, very damaging for the developing countries.
Thank you. Mrs. Janssen, on the OECD level, what are the ideas maybe to overcome this, hopefully not, but it seems to me that there is a gap between, or more and more, a growing gap between the Western, or to prevent any gap between the OECD bloc, so to say, and the rest, and maybe not to get too close to China. One instrument to bring at least some or many developing countries closer to China is the Belt and Road Initiative. And there has been much discussions about, in Europe we call it Global Gateway. Before it was labeled as connectivity strategy. From the United States we speak about Build Back Better. And here was the ambassador from, I guess it was Senegal, who has said to the German government there is not any euro cent spent by Global Gateway in the meantime, and you are discussing about this, we don't believe anymore. So what are your proposals and recommendations, or maybe ideas or plans on the OECD level?
Well, first, we take this situation very seriously. And I think the questions on the decoupling go beyond China, because according to some of these new legislations in the US or in the European Union, you may not only be in trouble if you source certain things from China, you may also be in trouble if you source them from India, but India has sourced from China. Or if you source from Vietnam and Vietnam has sourced from China. So one thing we are noticing that in Asia, increasingly countries are asking us, please don't oblige us to choose. And I think you made reference to this aspect. So that's a question we have to ask ourselves in Europe. What is our relationship with Asia beyond China? What can we expect? What is our strategy? It is roughly along the lines that I explained. We do consider this is a period where it is more useful than, particularly useful for our members to think about working together in a strategic way and potentially around common standards, common values. But to do this in a way that remains open to others. So we do have as one of our priorities open markets in a rules-based trading system, reference to the WTO with this, but we also have as a priority global engagement. Now, I can give you a concrete idea how these things are working out, and it's, as I said before, we are working on a case-by-case basis. Increasingly, we are wondering whether we have to put off phones when we have internal discussions. Our work is becoming more and more diplomatic, where this was predominantly technical in the past. We are currently in the process of negotiating, for instance, the modernization of our export credit arrangement. That is a policy tool we have at the OECD, where we agree among OECD members, and other countries have become members, of how much can we basically subsidize, support our export credits. What are the rules we apply in order to avoid that we hurt each other? We want to be competitive abroad, but don't want to hurt each other. Now, these rules had become outdated because we were not able to compete anymore against other countries like China. So we are negotiating currently to make these rules more lenient in the sense of make it easier to give credit. But we do this, and I'll come back to the argument I said before around values. We are negotiating to make those rules even more lenient for projects in environmentally friendly areas. So it's, yes, having a competitive strategic approach. We position ourselves as a bloc of joint countries, as the arrangement has always been, but do this very much also around common values that we define around sustainability. So that's the approach we are currently taking in a very challenging and difficult environment.
Thank you, Marion Jansen. A final question to all of you. Time perspective up to 2030. How do you evaluate this future, the next 6-7 years in international trade and supply chain security? Are you? Well, we start with Mrs. Jansen. Are you more pessimistic? Are you optimistic, and why? In brief.
I didn't want to start with this one. I think that we haven't hit the bottom yet, so things may become more complicated. Trade-wise, I hope that we're going to avoid things that are worse than trade wars, trade tensions. I hope that by 2030 we will have arrived at a moment where we move up again. And what is very important, that until that moment where we move up again and get ready again to work constructively with the whole world, that at that moment the WTO is still functioning. Because at that moment we will want to go back to the WTO. We don't want to create a new WTO. If not, you would have to build it. But the place to talk again constructively with China and the entire rest of the world is going to be the WTO. don't think that's going to be in 2 years. I'm a bit pessimistic, but maybe other speakers are more optimistic about that.
Mrs. Gasser, what's your take?
I support everything you said about the importance of the WTO, definitely, but I agree that it's going to take a little bit more. However, and we are at crossroads right now in international trade. Very similar situation when the ICC was founded in 1919. So, but I also feel more positive, and I want to thank the German business community and the German government, because we do have the opportunity of bringing trade to a different level and making it more inclusive and sustainable with the digitalization of documents of trade. And that is going to be a very big opportunity to upgrade trade internationally, even though we are dealing with all of these circumstances that are very challenging right now.
An entrepreneur like Jürgen has to be per se an optimist, right? So therefore, I would like to ask you,
Can you read my eyes?
Therefore, I would like to ask you the question, do you have contingency plannings for something could happen, China, Taiwan, and sanctions from the Western world?
Actually, no, there's no chance. There's no chance. If something happens something military will be happening if between China and Taiwan, and we cannot get shipments for 3-4 months, then we'll hang out a sign, say we are bankrupt, and all our competitors also. Everybody.
Okay, but you're optimistic.
But I'm very optimistic. I don't believe there will be a military steps taken by China. I don't believe it. This is not Chinese. No.
And the next question I will raise to you after 4 weeks' time, when you will have met your counterparts, your Chinese counterparts in person, right?
Call me, yes.
Yeah. Okay, we will do. Yeah, Christian Vorwig.
Yeah, well, I expect for the next 6 years, I think a lot of work to do, because we have this different situation in the world. We had a wake-up call after the war in Russia, also with the new rhetoric coming from China. We are not decoupling from China. We are de-risking from China. I think this is a better expression here. We're not in a way of decoupling. Neither is the US a decoupling from China. But this is a question of competitiveness, because we're competing with a state-led economy. This is something different. We can't address with the current WTO rules, so we need modernization. That's a huge workload to do under the heading of level playing field, reform of the WTO. We need the WTO. More than 60% of our trade is done by WTO rules today, German trade. And the rest is to building on our alliances with partners. On a first stage, I would see the US, but also Latin America, the USMCA partners, and other regions in the world, in Asia, in Africa, and this is where we have a lot of work to do. And well, what we're looking for is looking also to the informations we got yesterday on the climate change. This is a decisive period for the climate change. What we are trying to make clear to everybody is that trade can really contribute to sustainability, is a part of sustainability, and through more trade and more qualitative higher trade, we get more sustainability in the world. And this is, in this audience, I think it's very clear, but we have other audiences as with NGOs, and the last week where we have confronted with the option better no trade at all, yeah, better refrain from trade completely, get away, leave those people where they are, leave the rainforest where it is. Let's concentrate here locally on what we do here. This is not what we are looking for, and well, with this, I think this is what I expect for the next 6 years to come.
Thank you so much, and thank you all of you for your contributions and your dedication to international trade, as I've learned. Am I right? Yeah. We answered the question, the more the better, with I would say, it's complex, it's challenging, but at the end of the day, we are optimistic, and we work on that optimism. It's not for granted. that a confident outlook will really materialize. So thank you once again, and please give the panel a great hand of applause. And with the comparison of Mrs. Garza, the founding year of the International Chamber of Commerce in 1919, which were also very, very challenging times and might be also complex. This brings me to say thank you very much for being here. I do hand over to the ICC, the so to say founding manager of ICC Germany in 1919. No, that's not true, Oliver Wieck, but the current Secretary General of the ICC Germany. I might be old, but I'm not that old. Or your concluding remarks.
So, well, thank you very much to this very distinguished panel for a very lively discussion on the challenges of international trade. Thank you very much to you, Volker, and the DIHK, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, for hosting this event and for partnering us for this second ICC Supply Chain Forum. I'm not going to dare to come or to conclude this discussion with a few words, but I want to come back and try to answer the question we have been asking you on this panel, regulating international trade, the more the better. My conclusion after this discussion is that the more is not necessarily better, but if there's regulation, then do it better. And what I mean is, in very brief and short words, first of all, we need a more holistic approach on regulation. It doesn't make any sense if we have various national lawmakers reinventing the rule or regulating international trade, and in addition, on a European level, having again different lawmakers and different initiatives in regulating trade, which are sometimes contradicting, which are sometimes overlapping, and certainly not helpful for industry and for companies who are exporting. What they should also be, regulation should also always consider the impact it has on companies. First of all, on the companies in their own constituency. And here one example would be the protection of human rights. Can companies fulfill all the conditions of such kind of legislation? Do they need help, and what kind of help? And do the countries where the companies want to invest and trade with need help? What we should also, and here I'm very thankful for Maria Fernanda for joining this discussion today, consider the impact this has on other companies from outside Europe. Because in the end, we will then only trade between ourselves, between befriended countries, and this is something State Secretary Annan isn't here anymore. Certainly, the politicians from international cooperation and development wouldn't agree with that. We also need the rest of the world to join us in trading, and particularly we, as an export-oriented country like Germany, have an interest, a deep interest in continuing international trade with all companies with all countries and with all companies in the world who certainly fulfill a certain level of standards, but we should help them. We should be open, and we should discuss, and we should negotiate and involve them in our ideas and give them time, as you said. So, well, this was a summary maybe somehow. Thank you very much also to the audience here in the room. Thank you very much to the audience who are participating virtually. Unfortunately, you participating virtually, I cannot invite to our reception, which will take place outside, but maybe next time you can join us. And everyone is certainly invited to join us tomorrow and after tomorrow to our 4 workshops on the impact of digitalization on sustainability and climate action, on business and on human rights, on due diligence, on efficiency and fraud prevention, and last but not least, how the future of paperless trade will look like. Hope you can join. See you tomorrow, see you after tomorrow, and have a very nice evening. Thank you very much for coming.